There are some directors whose movies you can turn on halfway through with absolutely no prior information or context, watch for about 5 seconds, and immediately recognize. There's something so specific and recognizable about their style that it can't help but coming through in every frame. These are our picks for the 5 most idiosyncratic directors of all time. First up, we're looking at the directors whose personality tends to be most expressed through their cinematography. Sure, this might not be the only way it comes out, but it's definitely the most obvious one. If the picture hasn't cut in about 5 minutes, it's choreographed with the action like a ballet, and seems to occasionally have a mind of its own, that's probably an Alfonso Cuarón film on your screen. And if everyone seems to be facing the same direction, even when they're looking at each other, you're probably watching an Ozu flick. If you're on a long lens staring up at a character, looking off into the distance, dollying around them, congratulations! You got yourself a Michael Bay joint on your hands. Cue explosions! And if every single shot has a crazy lens flare, then, well, you know who that is. A Spielberg picture will have beautifully staged sequence shots on a dolly with characters moving themselves into and out of different scale compositions, strongly backlit if not silhouetted. A David Fincher film will have a soft amber tone, an immense sense of visual sharpness, and almost impossibly precise panning of the camera. If you're at all familiar, you can also probably pick out the films of Tarsem Singh, Busby Berkeley, Paul Greengrass, Sergio Leone, and Jean-Pierre Jeunet by their cinematography too. But if there's a filmmaker whose every single frame is dripping with his own particular visual fetish, to our eye, it's gotta be Gaspar Noe. What started as a slightly too intense color palette and searching camera in parts of I Stand Alone became an oppressively saturated glare and wild, freewheeling point of view in Irreversible, and eventually bloomed into a constantly pulsating neon and floating, disembodied soul of a camera that seems to move hypnotically through both space and time in Enter the Void. His most recently released feature Love held strong with the lighting, but took a step back with the camera and had us questioning our guts on this call. But his upcoming film, Climax, seems to be a return to form. Always justified by the story, Noé's aesthetics shock and awe and disorient and show us the world in a completely new way. And despite revealing themselves primarily through his camera, there are other subtler trademarks at play: strobing titles, flickering cuts, nauseating sound, each of which betrays an irresponsible desire to disorient, repulse, and discomfort his audience. His work is reactionary, provocative, and violently stylistic, but it's also so unbelievably specific and, in a way, limited in its methods that there is no doubt there is something deep and fundamental of Noé himself embedded in the how. Next up, we're looking at the filmmakers who wait until post-production to really pull out the stops. This is Godard, who made a name for himself early on by inventing his trademark jump cut. And it's Zack Snyder, who can be identified by his telltale action sequence Speed Ramp. And Martin Scorsese, whose legendary collaboration with Thelma Schumacher has resulted in a career-spanning edit vocabulary that reveals itself most in its montages and freeze frame. And then, of course, there's Tony Scott, who pushed his grades to the absolute limit and cut some of the most extravagant music video montages in the middle of his action sequences. John Woo, Guy Ritchie, and Sam Peckinpah also fit into this category. But if there's one director whose transitions practically scream his name, we think that name probably sounds a whole lot like Edgar Wright. Quite like an Edgar Wright quick montage. Introduced to the world in Shaun of the Dead as a way to poke fun at action movie suit-up sequences, and expanded upon in Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim, and The World's End, these sequences on their own might seem like more of a recurring gag than a uniform editorial style. But taking a look at Baby Driver, a film where Wright largely resisted the temptation to just shut up and play the hits, and then returning to all the rest of his earlier work, one begins to notice that these moments are just the most extreme examples of a real, unavoidable Edgar Wrightness to how all these films are assembled. And to our eyes, the water in which Wright seems to always swim is made up of rhythm, musicality, and speed. There is an immense kineticism to how his stories seem to continuously explode forward in massive leaps, in every transition, every encounter, every new element that arrives on screen. And it plays like the beat of the music, cutting in such a way that the soundtrack is paced perfectly with the edit, which is paced perfectly with the actions on screen. Every cut or series of cuts plays like a high-tempo drum fill, and it all all crackles with such a unique electricity that, seeing any of his work smash across the screen, it's impossible not to know who's behind it. Moving right along, we're next considering those directors that build their personalities into the world, whose main idiosyncrasies are in the production design. Is there anything that screams Cronenberg more than his totally original body horror makeup effects? Or anyone else that would dare hew so religiously to a color palette than Yimou Zhang? Or any set design as monomaniacal as Roy Andersson's bleak, drab, perfectly quotidian Scandinavian still lives? Tim Burton's worlds are the offspring of a really sad clown and a really happy funeral. And Terry Gilliam's universe is a madcap Rube Goldberg hoarder yard sale. Dario Argento, Baz Luhrmann, and Jodorowsky also deserve the most honorable of mentions in this category. But for our pick, we're going with what we think is the only reasonable choice in this category, our guy in the tweed suit, Wes Anderson. It almost seems redundant to actually explain Wes Anderson's style out loud. He basically does that for you in every film he's ever made, and even in one hilarious self-parody American Express commercial. It's a highly limited pastel palette, an immaculately arranged dollhouse world with everything at a right angle to everything else and the camera. It's all a little bit vintage, a little bit too perfect. Hell, he even does it the exact same way in stop motion. So, instead, we want to defend our categorization here. Maybe it seems like we're dropping the ball by limiting the scope of the man's peculiarities to his art department, because he's also always framing everything the same way, moving the camera the same way, speaking the same way. But lots of filmmakers center punch their shots, and lots of filmmakers have shot films with highly planometric and orthogonal movement. And we haven't even gotten to all the filmmakers that elicit specifically stilted performances, but nobody dresses a frame like Wes. Beyond the technical categories, some filmmakers inspire such particular peculiarity in their actor's performance that their imprint on that portion of the film is undeniable. Some of these filmmakers do this by just starring in their films, like Charlie Chaplin and Jacques Tati, each with their own remarkably identifiable brands of slapstick. But then there's a filmmaker like Robert Bress, whose highly micromanaged work with mostly non-actors has an unmistakable, I guess you'd say, Bresson-y wooden quality. Or the Coen brothers, who somehow managed to inject an incredibly consistent amount of farce into their tragedy and tragedy into their farce. We think Judd Apatow belongs on this list too. His improv-heavy style of comedy has an indescribable air of you know it when you see it. And we could just as easily talk about Woody Allen, Martin McDonagh, and Mike Leigh. But for our fourth pick, we think there's no one getting performances as oddly specific as Yorgos Lanthimos.
I'm sorry, I've got blood on your shirt. But don't worry, there are many ways to remove bloodstains from clothing. One way is to rinse the clothes with cold water, then rub with sea salt.
While Lanthimos probably landed on most viewers' radars with his recent English-language debut, The Lobster, the peculiar deadpan of nearly all his actors has been there from the start. And despite the near ubiquity of this feature, he claims to not request it of his actors. Apparently, he just tells them to say the words in a way that feels right. But apparently, if you combine these words with a bunch of journeys down roads that seem to always end in sex and violence, the result renders human behavior absurd by abstracting it from the passion that usually accompanies it in these most extreme circumstances. It's colored his entire oeuvre with a flat, blunt effect that resonates along a uniquely unusual emotion somewhere in the overlap of hilarious and bleak that seems like it shouldn't even exist. And lastly, because not all stylish film directors are so easily articulated, and not all of their idiosyncrasies are so apt for categorization, we want to talk about directors who seem to always strike the exact same tone. There's something indescribable you feel when you watch their movies, and it's there no matter how it looks, or how it cuts, or how their actors perform. It hews across multiple genres, decades, and apparent styles. It's a certain je ne sais quoi, but you can feel it nonetheless. It's a sense of absurdity in every movie Luis Buñuel has ever made. It's the feeling of a walking dream in any movie credited to David Lynch. The beautiful ache of being in a Tarkovsky film. Tarantino has made a career of accumulating an ever-exaggerating sense of self-referential Tarantino-ness. And maybe this is a little too stereotypically film school of us, but we really do think the clearest example of this is the vibe we get from the work of Stanley Kubrick.
Hey, the weather forecast said it's gonna snow tonight.
What do you want me
Kubrick's work is perhaps the most interesting entry on this list precisely because there isn't a particularly consistent concrete feature to his work that you can point to and say, aha, there it is. There is the essence of Kubrick. And yet, anyone familiar with his catalog likely needs very little convincing that there is, in fact, an essence in there. It's almost a cliche to call the emotional effect of his films cool or cold or icy, maybe detached or indifferent if you want to add a few more syllables, but that's what it is, and it's remarkable in its consistency. And sure, he uses the one-point perspective and the long, unmoving gaze and a whole lot of classical music, and it all belongs to a weird alchemy of his sterile wide-angle lenses, his rigid, disaffected camera movement, his strangely calm actors, except when it belongs to some other weird alchemy of him doing almost the exact opposite. If we tried to really explain it, and I'm not sure we can, I think we'd probably best chalk it up to actual, genuine art, where an incredibly talented filmmaker managed to put a feeling into all of us that honestly existed inside of him. And no matter what way he went about that expression, the stuff inside couldn't help but coming out, which is why we think he's one of the most fantastically idiosyncratic filmmakers of all time. So what do you think? Do you disagree with any of our picks? Do we leave out any of your favorite idiosyncratic filmmakers? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more CineFix movie lists.